I get DMs all the time on Instagram from parents who are like, "Oh my, this thing happened and my child was able to come and tell me and we were able to have the conversation. I'm so grateful that, we had the talks before." But there's no regret. Like no parent has ever, messaged me and said, "I regret telling my kid this." That's just not going to happen.
Okay, Rosalia, thank you so much for joining us on Consider Before Consuming today. We're excited to just dive right in. We think our listeners will really learn a lot from what you have to share with us today. So, can you start by just sharing a bit about yourself and what led you to become an advocate for consent parenting and abuse prevention?
Yeah, a little bit about me. I'm a consent educator and a body safety educator. I really focus on child sexual abuse prevention and working predominantly with parents, and now more and more with schools as well, to educate them on the issue of abuse prevention, the rates of child sexual abuse, and how to, be able to do something about it, to take action. So beyond just educating their own children, which is, of course, super important, learning how to talk to other adults about this topic that unfortunately still has a lot of stigma around it. But I think through conversations like this and conversations in general, where parents feel confident to have these conversations, we can change the statistics. And so that's really my goal with the work that I do. I'm a mom of three boys, and I see that as a really incredible privilege to raise them in a way that breaks cycles and doesn't create perpetrators into the world, like really being conscious about that. So that's they're the reason I started doing this work and the reason that I'm continuing, every day on this mission. I can share that for me, when I was growing up, because I grew up in such a sex negative home, where we didn't talk about sex, you couldn't even ask about it. Like my mom couldn't even use the correct anatomical words for body parts. This was in the 90s, again, like I'm hearing like, music from Little Kim and all these, artists who we're really talking about provocative things on the radio, and again, access is so much easier today. So when you're hearing songs from like Billie Eilish, Oxytocin, which is really about BDSM, um, and then a kid's curious, like, what does that mean? And then they're seeking it out. Like, I had those similar experiences where I didn't really understand what they were saying, but I knew it had to do with sex. And so what I would seek out was like, HBO like had late night, shows about sex or real sex stories and trying to get access to sexual health information in my late teens. And unfortunately, because I was trying to find things and I had friends who were like, "Oh, you should check this out." Or, once I became an adult and I was, 18, 19, I mean, and I don't even, looking back on that, it's like you're not an adult at that point. You're like, starting your infancy of adulthood. But I just remember thinking, okay, well, I can seek out stuff now on my own. And it was sort of the portal into pornography. And in the beginning, it was just like, oh, this is what that looks like, and this is how it happens. And I found myself trying to like mimic the way that women looked or the way that they behaved in those films. What ultimately was most disturbing for me was when I started noticing the aggressiveness with which like men were treating women, and because I didn't, no one had taught me about consent. I just assumed like certain things meant that you're agreeing to this, and like if you're in the middle of that, then you just gotta like go through with it, and it really warped my sense of autonomy and consent, and like I didn't understand any of it, and unfortunately I was in a lot of situations where I was taken advantage of because I was mimicking what I saw. So once I recognized that I no longer wanted to consume it, I realized that while I was in the moments of intimacy with someone, I was thinking about what I had seen instead of being present in the moment. It really disrupted what I had, like my sense of understanding of what real intimacy is. what pleasure is. Like it just seemed very one-sided, and anyway, it just kind of reinforced a lot of negative things that I had already watched in the media and just assumed, oh, this is how that goes. And it wasn't until really I met with my husband, who we've been together 19 years now, really helped me understand healthy sex and healthy relationships. And so I put, pornography down for many, many years. And when I started hearing about like, oh, kids are starting to access it, in my mind, it was like what was happening in the 90s and early 2000s, right? And which was bad enough as it was. And just as a research, I put my research hat on and I was like, what are kids seeing today? And I was so horrified because it has escalated to a whole other level. I mean, what I remember seeing this one site where it was these college girls that were hazing, I guess it was like a sorority, and they were hazing each other and forcing the girls in the sorority to do these horrendous things. And it was like, I don't even remember what the site was on, like some porn site, but I just remember like shutting it off immediately and like needing to calm my nervous system down because what I was witnessing was sexual violation on a large scale, and feeling so horribly sad for these girls, and just that was a wake up moment of like, oh my God, this is what kids are consuming today. And if they're doing the same thing that I did because they come from a home where nobody talked about this and that's what they're finding as education, I mean, we're not going in the right direction if we're not doing something about that. So this, that really reinforced for me, like I need to talk to my kids and I need to make sure that they don't access this stuff because it's really it's poison.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, and um, for letting your personal experience be what has motivated you to pursue this path, and in working with parents and creating and building resources to ensure that we're kind of sounding the alarm on this. Once again, we don't live in the world that existed in the 90s. And as you pointed out, it was bad enough as it was. So I think it's really important that we're having these conversations to address these issues in this way, but also certainly with our children to be sure that we can combat this, because it is horrific, the type of content that young people are exposed to today. Well, we're so grateful for your work. We have a lot of parents who engage with our resources and listen to the podcast. And can you share why it's so crucial for parents to teach their children about consent from an early age? Many parents are often hesitant, or they think it's too young, or they're hesitant to introduce something their kids weren't already thinking about. So can you share why it's so crucial for parents to be the ones engaging in this way?
Yeah, I mean, nobody else is talking about these topics. And if they do, sometimes it's the wrong messaging or it's unsafe messaging, right? So if we as parents aren't the ones driving these conversations, then we're really handing that power over to others. But we can start early with these conversations in an empowering way where it's not a scary conversation. It's not any, it's not about fear mongering to our kids. But the beauty of this is that we help teach kids about their rights, their innate rights, which most kids don't, they're not raised with that information. I mean, I didn't know that until I became really an adult. I didn't understand what autonomy was or that it unlocks at different stages and ages. So that in and of itself is such critical information to understand autonomy. You can't teach about consent without that foundation. So we can get started with that really early by just teaching kids about the rights to bodies and then about boundaries and how to set boundaries, how to respect the boundaries of others, right? It's a two-way street. And then, of course, consent, which is really just another way of saying permission, helping kids understand this concept in a really age appropriate way and to let them know, again, two-way street. So, really, it's not just about helping them learn to protect themselves, which ultimately is not even their responsibility. But the reason that we want to start with these foundations is that they are a strong springboard to then learn about body safety. And then it doesn't become a weird conversation because kids are like, oh, I have these rights. I understand my boundaries and that I should ask for permission or that others should ask for permission. And so it just sets you up for success to be able to teach body safety in an empowering way. So I think we can start with kids as early, as soon as they're born, just in the way that we communicate with them. And then, of course, how we help other adults and caregivers communicate with them. So it's really a powerful conversation, especially even for survivors who didn't grow up with that or whose own rights were violated. To be able to break that cycle and change the narrative, I think is super powerful and important as part of healing and breaking those cycles.
Yeah. Can you share? You mentioned we can help other adults learn how to communicate with children. Can you give an example of that? I think that might be something a lot of people are unfamiliar with the idea of.
For sure. Well, I think, family members come to mind first, because we, usually share our children in a way with them, right? Like whether it's grandparents or uncles, even cousins, right? So being able to have these open conversations with them to say, we're learning about body safety. These are the practices that we're doing. These are our family safety rules. We would love for you to learn about it, to be part of our safety team. So it's not a conversation that has to at any point, unless you see some red flags. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It doesn't have to be confrontational. It actually can be a beautiful invitation to teach others. Just as the way that we're learning about it ourselves, we can educate others. So just by being honest and saying, I'm just starting to learn about this, and I didn't learn about it when I was a kid. And especially if you're talking to a grandparent, and they might get defensive, right? And be like, well, you're okay. You were, and the thing is, even if you didn't experience sexual violence yourself, now that you know the facts, why would you let that risk stay as is instead of reducing it? So just educating them and saying, you didn't have that information when you were raising me. I get it. I have that information now, thank goodness. And I have all these tools, and I would love to share that with you. And like inviting them in, calling them in, can be really powerful so that they then know what are the boundaries, what are the tools that I can use, what are the parameters, that my kids are setting up for my grandkids, and how can I participate. Some you might come across, some pushback in some, situations, and that's kind of to be expected because again, it's an older generation. But staying firm to your, family rules and knowing that your child's safety is the priority, and sometimes adults' feelings will, get hurt, and they might have to get over it, and there might be a situation where there's people that get cut out for a while because they need some time to reflect on that. So it's a challenging situation in that sense if you come across that resistance, but know that you're doing the right thing by standing up for your child and being that really powerful upstander.
Yeah, I think that's really incredible encouragement. Let's talk about grooming a little bit. Grooming is a term that many parents may have heard but might not fully understand. Can you explain what grooming is and what it can look like?
Yeah, grooming, I think, is something most people are still unaware of. They think because of, this narrative of like stranger danger, and thinking that, assault just happens, out of nowhere. But the fact is that offenders work to gain the trust of not just the child, but the parents first, those caregivers, right? They're the first line of defense. So if they can get past that, then they can access the child. And so essentially what grooming is are strategies that offenders use to gain that trust and that access and the opportunity to abuse a child. So first, grooming starts as a strategy to gain the, trust of the parent or the caregiver. And then once they have access to the child, then they start grooming the child. And so there's different strategies and tactics that they will use to do that so that their defenses go down, their boundaries go down, and then they can move into that stage of actual abuse, and then the secrecy. And the grooming is really set up so that the secrecy part holds, and the child feels implicated, or they feel, I can't tell anyone because look at all these things that happened beforehand. So it's kind of like setting a trap and being able to ensnare your victim. So grooming is something that I think all parents really need to learn about. They need to know what the signs are, how to spot them, how to call out, how to intervene, so that they can potentially interfere that process of abuse. And so some signs that I think are some general ones, because there's lots, but some general ones are, trying to offer themselves as helpful, particularly again with parents, if they're single parents, how can they assist financially or care, offering childcare, gift giving, lavishing the child with attention or the parents with attention and support. Um, there's also, of course, then finding ways to get a child to keep a secret. This can include things like sexual exposure to either themselves in person or showing them, explicit content. A lot of times, initially in the beginning, it's more about like, how can I make it look accidental? So that, in case the child says something, then it's, oh, I'm so sorry, that was totally an accident. So sadly, there's a lot of thought that goes into grooming. We know that there's predatory communities online that share tips with each other on how to groom children or parents effectively. So it's really important that parents become aware of what the signs are. And there's some others. I won't go deep into it, but there's lots of resources, today available to help parents learn about grooming. So highly encourage that parents get educated on that.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned explicit material and predatory communities online. Can you speak about how pornography contributes to grooming, both in terms of how predators use it and how it influences a child's perception of relationships and consent?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many connections, and this isn't something that I think people think, oh, with the digital age, but pornography's been used for decades, even before we had the internet. If it was a magazine or if it was like a videotape, cassette or something, this was a strategy that was used to introduce a child to the concepts of sexuality and sex, and depending on the child's age, and they're approached differently. So if a child is young and they're playing something like Roblox, inviting them to, like I think they're called condos or something, right? Like I can't remember the name of it, but just finding ways that will entice or allure a young child, or a teen or tween or teen. So if someone's grooming them online, they might send them a link or they might send them explicit videos or images just as a way to open up a conversation about sex and sexuality. Sometimes they will, say, "Oh, you're so mature that I think that your parents don't want you to see this," and but you're old enough. And so unfortunately, if parents aren't having those conversations ahead, the child may not recognize that this is a red flag. They are being, what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially being tricked, right, into thinking, oh, my parents don't want me to see this for some reason, but this person's telling me I'm mature enough, and my parents don't know me. And a lot of times offenders will use that strategy to entice the child to consume more explicit content or to create it, which is, of course, even worse.
And how can parents teach their children to recognize that manipulative or predatory behavior without instilling fear?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, there's two parts to the answer. I think one is our parenting. I think conscious parenting is really key here, and I say conscious, not gentle parenting, because there is a difference. I think conscious parenting is really about learning to build a honest, open, and connected communication space where your highest value is honesty with your child, and creating that safety, right? That sense of safety. And I think when we create those spaces for children to feel that there's a shame-free space to ask questions, to, I heard such and such thing at the playground, and your parent's not going to get mad because you're asking the question, then you're creating a safe space for them to come to you. Also, at this point, I think when kids are really young, we want to help them develop their sense of intuition, their understanding of those body signals. If something is making you feel strange and you can't really understand what that feeling is, then, come to me and we can work it out together. We can figure out what's going on. But it's so important that you listen to your body and those signals that are telling you something's not right. Or something feels odd. I think being honest about these things, and especially if our children are, going through that stage in puberty, that those teen and tween years, that are so important when kids' hormones are changing and they're, sort of awakening to other aspects of relationships and things like that. These are really critical times to have those open conversations. So setting that up early by talking about, using tools. One of my favorite books on teaching kids about red flag behavior is a book by Kimberly called I Said No. And it talks about, red flags. What are they? And it's in an age appropriate way that's not meant to be scary. It's meant to help kids, recognize something that's not safe and then be able to tell and feel safe telling, right? There's a lot of fear of like, what if I made a mistake and I didn't recognize the red flag sign and I made that mistake? Is it okay to tell my parent? If you've set that up, then you have a higher chance of that child coming to you and being able to disrupt the escalation of whatever that situation was. So I think conscious parenting, teaching kids honestly about red flags in an age appropriate way. Again, so many great tools. And then just having those ongoing, not leaving them to the last minute, not being reactive, but being proactive. And I'll tell you myself, I have kids 9 to 13. We're having these conversations regularly. There's kids who are saying things on the playground and they come home and they're like, what is that? What is this kid talking about? What does that mean? And then being able to have that difficult conversation in an age appropriate, shame free way. We want to steer kids towards healthy behaviors, right? And the only way we can do that is really through communication that is safe for them. So really working on building that throughout all of their childhood years and not saying, okay, I think I've had I think I covered it. Even when your child is like, okay, mom, like I get it. And then our job at that point is to say, okay, what's a different angle that I can approach this with so that we can continue these conversations? How can I make it relevant to my child at their new age and stage so that we can keep having these really important conversations? So there's lots of different ways. Those are just some off the top of my head that I think are the most powerful. But again, so many resources out there today to help parents have these really critical conversations. I think they're more important than ever.
That's such a beautiful way to say that. I think so many parents are afraid of, exposing their children to the darkest things in the world, right? The potential that's out there. But it is so much scarier often for kids to experience something and not have safe adults to go to, or to feel shame about it, or to feel like it was their fault, and to not know that they have a safe adult to go to. So I think that's such a good perspective to take with this.
Do you mind if I share a quick story, actually?
Please do. Please do.
This actually happened during the pandemic, and my oldest was 9 at the time. We had been given a device from the school. It was an iPad that I assumed, and I made the erroneous assumption that it had, the filters in place and it was set up so that, there wasn't any danger. All of our computers at home were safeguarded. So I assumed the same of the school. And again, this was during COVID, so I think a lot of the schools were overwhelmed, but they were handing out devices like it was candy, right? And my child had been watching some cartoon where there was like a girl that turned into, I think, a cat or something. It was like a cartoon about that. And so he just curious went online and searched like girl turns into cat or something. And these thumbnails came up that were essentially misleading. And my child clicked on it and didn't realize that it was leading to a porn site, which had pop ups. And fortunately, we had had those discussions previously about like what to do because I knew statistically 9 was the average age of exposure. So I was really reluctant because I was one of those parents who was like, 9, like my kid's not going to like search stuff at that age. Like, he's not going to go look up sex or porn or anything. So I did it anyway because that's my job. And I was like, I'm going to have this conversation. And it wasn't as uncomfortable as I thought because we had some tools. I had, the good pictures, bad pictures books. So that was really helpful. We talked about exit strategies if that ever came up. And then, like literally a month later, this happened. And my child was like shocked when it happened. Didn't initially tell me right away because he was like kind of dumbfounded with what he thought, what he saw. It didn't make sense. And then, about 3 or 4 days later, he finally told me and said, Mom, I this happened. I remembered what you said to do, and I turned it off. But like, and I thought I made a mistake, and you were gonna get mad, so I didn't want to tell you right away. But I really didn't understand what I saw, and it's really been bothering me. And like, we were able to have a conversation about what it was and what happened, and of course, changed like the settings for all the things and made sure that everything was safe again. I was really upset about it with the school, but this was, a learning experience for me to say, wow, I'm so glad that I had that conversation. And it was just in the nick of time. And it was a good lesson for me in terms of schools and, all the other things with my other kids. So this was really, I think, just for me, a good lesson to say to parents, like, don't wait, don't think, not my kid, because it's a, I mean, the messaging is out there. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. So we have to have these conversations. And I was so glad that my child felt safe to come tell me. And I was like, okay, I did the right thing. I created enough of a safe space and a shame-free space that my child was able to come to me and we were able to have that conversation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's such a beautiful example of, um, we do live in the world we live in, and kids are going to be exposed. It's not if, it's when. And even if your child is not seeking it out directly, they may not even know what it is, but they may still stumble upon it. And that's true for so many kids, even younger than 9, unfortunately. We hear, when I was 6, when I was 7, all of the time. And so it's not if, it's when, and you want to be the person your kids will come to about this and not Google, because they will have questions. So I think that's such a good example of when this works the right way. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good segue actually into my next question. Largely due to increased porn exposure among younger and younger kids, we are seeing a rise of child-on-child sexual assault, sexual abuse. How do conversations about consent differ when you're teaching kids about interactions with adults versus interactions with other children?
To me, I think it doesn't really change in terms of how to teach it. It's just a matter of including the fact that you can say, it's not just, something that has to do with adults. It's anybody. It can be your sibling, it can be your cousin, it can be your friend at school. And we know also that peer pressure is a real thing, and especially as kids get older. So also having those conversations about, you know, um, if somebody is asking you to do this and saying that's what's required to be your friend, then that's not a real friend, right? So having those kinds of conversations around, self-value and what healthy friendships look like, and understanding, that someone would never ask you to break a body safety rule if they are truly a safe friend. So, just including that as part of the conversation. And then again, depending on the age of your child, those conversations around peer pressure, I think, are really key as well.
Fight the New Drug has been advocating for love for over 16 years. Our resources have helped millions of students, parents, families, couples, individuals, and communities worldwide. But our resources have been stretched thin, and we need help bridging a critical funding gap. If you've experienced the impact of this movement in your own life or someone else's, now's the time to help by making a donation today. Every donation, no matter the amount, makes a significant difference. We exist today because of your belief in this movement, your trust in our mission, and your financial support. Together we can help this movement going and help reduce sexual exploitation. To donate to Fight the New Drug today, visit ftnd.org/donate. That's ftnd.org/donate.
As kids are getting a little bit older, it's natural for them to have questions about sex, right? And in your experience, how can parents effectively counteract the unrealistic and often harmful messages about sex and relationships that kids might absorb from pornography?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even beyond just pornography. It's like in all media, right? I think media has just become so much more sexualized at younger and younger ages. And I mean, I remember like growing up in the 90s, I was exposed to things like Little Kim and, Foxy Brown and like all there, Nine Inch Nails had the music that was out. Like, it's not that it has changed that dramatically, but the access to it has. And that's what I think
Right.
a lot of parents are not seeing clearly. is that the access is so much more available. So I think just, I'm a truth teller. So with my kids, I've always tried to be as honest as I could, and which was really challenging, to be honest, because I grew up in a really strict household where sex was never talked about. If anything, it was a very sex negative home. So I never felt safe asking questions. So I think, starting with body literacy from a young age really helps set up these conversations. And again, if you're feeling really challenged by that, if it's like it's creating a pit in your stomach, and not because you're like, I can't do this, it's so uncomfortable. um, practice with a friend, get some tools, there's so many resources available today to have these conversations in an age appropriate way so that you don't have to do all that heavy lifting. And especially if you never had the language because it wasn't taught to you, it doesn't come natively. So use those tools, practice, get some support, maybe that's a friend, maybe it's a partner, a spouse, whoever it is, do this as a team if you can, just so that you have some language around that. And then, if you're feeling like kind of late to the game, like how do we do this? Again, there's lots of resources for that too. And then just find opportunities where you're kind of like doing other things, and this can be kind of a side conversation, so it doesn't feel like you're confronting your child with this topic. And take it slow. Like, don't feel like you have to rush through it. So take the time, do the work, get the support, get the tools, and start having these conversations. Like, just muster up the courage to do it if it feels uncomfortable. Because the truth is that if you're not the one having these conversations, the internet will have these conversations with your child, and they will misguide them. And unfortunately, we see the way, the movie Adolescence just showed, like, it's so easy for boys in particular to fall, into these communities where they're finding answers in the wrong places, right? And that's not what we want. So be proactive. Don't wait until something comes up and then you're scrambling to go, how do I, deal with this, and how do I fix it? The more we can get ahead of the conversation, the more comfortable your child's going to be hearing about it too. It won't feel awkward, and it takes the shame out of it because you're being proactive to talk about it. And the way that your tone normalizes the conversation is really their template for how to have those conversations with you. So if you're coming at this like stressed out and, unsure and nervous, that's what they're going to pick up on, and that's how they're going to respond. So, this is why I say it's so important to get support to have these. So whether that's an online community of other parents, or your spouse, or your, family member, whoever it is, talk to them and say, like, I need a game plan. I'm not sure what to do. I need some help. Like, can I practice with you what I'm going to say? Just take action.
You said a couple of key things I really want to be sure our listeners caught on to. One, we often hear from adults who are doing this work, working with parents in this space, that as adults, we are often way more uncomfortable talking about this topic with young people than they are, right? Because of, as you mentioned, maybe we didn't grow up with the same kind of openness around these topics, or it would have been uncomfortable for us to have this conversation with our parents because they never opened the door for us. So I think it's important to note that they are way less likely to be as uncomfortable with this as we think they might be. We often hear from young people when we present in schools, I wish my parents would have talked to me about this. I wish I would have been able to ask them questions about this because I have questions. So I think that's so key. And then I love that you mentioned, I think often parents or adults, we think about like the sex talk that we kind of grew up with. That's kind of the one-time event. And it's really not that we want to create, right? It's an ongoing discussion. So I loved the point of, when you're doing the dishes or doing something else, that this is just kind of part of the conversation. I think that will help make it more comfortable for you and for them, right? To just know this is kind of an ongoing part of what we're doing. So I think that's great advice. And practicing is great advice as well.
Last thing too to that is, I think, to your point about parents are a lot more uncomfortable than kids. Again, this also depends on age, and I just want to reiterate for parents who have teenagers who are like, oh, my kid doesn't want to hear about it. Actually, they do. It's just maybe the approach that you have. And so maybe shifting that approach, right? So looking at what are some other ways that I can approach this conversation if this one way hasn't worked. And I think a lot of parents tend to give up and they're like, oh, it's too late. And I'm not reaching them anymore. There's so many different ways. I mean, you can find an article that might be relevant to them that you can both discuss and say, I read this today and I was really shocked at like the statistics of teens. Like, have you heard about this? What's your experience in school? What are your friends saying? um, or you can say, I picked up this book for you to check out, obviously if it's an age appropriate book. And I just want you to have it as a resource. And if there's anything in there that you have questions about, like, just let me know. I'm here for it. I know that we've had these discussions before. Like, owning those mistakes too, I think is really powerful, especially for teenagers. And just to say, I don't want you to ever feel like you don't have someone to ask. I didn't have that, and I think a lot of times when we share our honest experiences from our own childhoods and our own teenage years, that can be really powerful to, kind of build a bridge of connection with our kids. So don't be afraid to say, I messed up or I made a mistake or I should have, talked to you about this earlier. But I just want to make sure that there, like, the door is always open. There's no question that I'm going to shame you about. Like, the door is open, so don't ever feel like just because your child is older and you didn't have this, that it's too late and they don't want to hear about it, especially if they're like, Mom, this is embarrassing, or I don't want to talk about this. It's like, okay, no problem. I totally get it. I was like that, but I wish that, my parents had pushed a little. So I just want to, let the door is open, right? So there's lots of different ways that we can approach that. And it's important to not give up.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it's often some parents think, no one talked to me about this and I turned out fine. And I think it's important to note that the world we're living in is not the same world as when this generation of parents and adults was kids, right? And that is because of things like you mentioned earlier, the access to this type of content with social media, with the internet. Can you talk about some of the dangers that exist on mainstream social media platforms that parents and young people might not be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started learning about this myself, I really thought, how are kids like getting direct access to porn sites through Instagram? Like, it's supposed to have these policies and they're supposed to have, safeguards around like
Right.
explicit content. But, we see this through accounts where OnlyFans, creators are putting out, images on their Instagram that just seem kind of sexy. Maybe they're in a bathing suit or they're, it's just a little bit scantily clad. Like, if you're a curious teenage boy or teenage girl that's following, some quote unquote model that they think, oh, they're talking about modeling or they're talking about this and that. And then you click on the link in their bio and it's straight to their OnlyFans page or to whatever other website, they've got their more explicit content on. Like, there you go. That's all you needed because there's no, filter, there's no age restriction. Sadly, it's that easy, right? And then we, of course, also see lots of these platforms allowing, really explicit content. Like, all you need to do is put a sticker over something and it's not like nobody knows what's behind that sticker. So, it's just it's shocking to me, how easy it is. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so against, young kids. I personally think social media shouldn't be allowed for any child under 16 personally. I know a lot of parents are like, oh, that's ridiculous. That's, like, what, my kid's going to eventually have to be on it. And then when they're on it, they're not going to know what to do. And to me, it's about education and making sure that children are being given online safety education before they get on. It's like saying, oh, I'm going to let you drive a car. And, you don't have to worry too much about the rules. Like, you've watched me drive, right? Like, you should be fine. So we don't do that with anything else. We shouldn't be doing it with something that essentially allows them to access so much dangerous content. And again, not even just explicit, but like anything having to do with mental health, eating disorders,
Right.
self-harm. We're seeing right now Facebook, Meta, I should say, being really, being made to have some accountability, if not, to change what they're doing, because like, it's just out of control at this point. And I'm shocked that not every parent is like, absolutely no social media. is like until you're at least 16 and you've done some education on not just online safety, but also media literacy.
I was a teenager when the internet was new-ish, but you couldn't access it on every device, and it was already difficult enough to be a teenager at that time. And so to be exposed to everything in the world before you really have the tools to know how to navigate and manage it would be impossible. It would be like driving a car without, learning how to drive a car, right? So I think it's good to remind parents to be extra cautious, even if they use social media. Likely their algorithm doesn't look like the one that their children or youth would be experiencing. So it's important to know what's out there. What are some steps parents can take to create a safer digital experience for their children across the board?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, and I will say I'm guilty of allowing my kids when they were really young to use iPads. I thought a lot of the iPads, this was again before I even started doing this work, that they were safe. There were safe apps on there. And, as I have learned throughout the years, both through learning from other educators as well as my own experiences, if we're not actively teaching kids about how to use technology safely, then
Right.
again, we're setting them up for danger and failure
Right.
in multiple ways. So I think it's just important to, as with body safety, start having these conversations early. There's so many great educators today, that are offering these kinds of educational tools and classes and support systems. So dive into that and start early, because even if your child isn't on social media until they're 16, these conversations matter with media in general. So media literacy is also a key component of online safety. It's not just about like strangers online or, even that language is dated. I think if we're just trying to like figure it out on our own, technology and language and the way that kids relate to it is shifting and moving so quickly that it can feel overwhelming to try to stay on top of it. And this is why I recommend seeking out experts who are teaching this to give you that guidance, so you don't have to do all that legwork on your own, because it can be overwhelming with the amount of tech that is kind of thrown at us and at kids every day. So media literacy is really critical. And it's as simple as watching something with your child and calling out something that you see as inappropriate. So I'll give you a really quick example of this. I was watching I can't remember the name of the movie now. I think it was like it was basically about these dogs that were spies. This was like a real reenactment, real like humans and dogs, but obviously the technology to make them speak. So there's
Right.
this dog that is going to be a spy. He's like previously part of a police force, so he's brought into this like spy lab or something to, it's kind of like a James Bond thing, right? And so they're mimicking this, and this one dog is kind of giving him the tour of this spy lab, and they're talking, and all of a sudden, like the music changes, and you see these two dogs that look very like fancy and luxurious, and they're like all of a sudden the music slows down and it gets really fancy, and the dogs walk by, and this German Shepherd, who's like the main character, he says, sorry to see you leave, but love to watch you go, or something like that. Like it was basically like a cat calling, moment.
Right.
And I was just shocked. I was like, I can't believe that that was put in this movie. I was watching it with my kids thinking it was okay. And after the movie ended, I brought that moment up and I said, you remember when this happened? I said, girls don't like that and it's actually not okay. It's actually really not cool. Like if somebody said that to me as I was walking past them, I'd be really annoyed and it would actually make me feel unsafe. And that's not okay. And like that's media literacy. That's calling out something and saying that was not okay. The people who made that film should have that, and because when kids are watching it and they see that as normal and appropriate, then they're going to reenact that behavior, right? Kids are sponges and they're seeing what's on the TV and thinking that's what's okay. So if we don't call that out, my kids were like 5 or 6 at the time. And I could have not said anything and just been like, oh my God, that's so like, why did they put that in there? But I took it as an opportunity to make it a teachable moment. And that is part of media literacy. Kids watching YouTube and seeing ads and saying, ad, why did they, show it? What are they trying to get you to do? that's media literacy. So there's lots of ways to teach it so that kids understand what they're consuming, who's making it, why are they making it, and that they can become critical thinkers instead of just unconscious consumers.
Yeah, and I love that, just calling out that moment of objectification that was displayed, right? Just briefly when it happened, it didn't have to be a big deal, but you could acknowledge it there in the moment. And it just, again, makes it part of this ongoing conversation where you can talk about any of these things or related topics as they come up. Thank you again for sharing these experiences you've had with your own children. As someone who's worked with so many parents looking for resources in this space, do you have other kind of success stories you could share with us about some moments where, you know, parents did the thing that seems difficult for parents to do and had these conversations and then saw it pan out in a positive way?
Yeah, I mean, I get DMs all the time on Instagram from parents who are like, "Oh my, this thing happened and my child was able to come and tell me and we were able to have the conversation. I'm so grateful that, we had the talks before." I think it, it's so common at this point. I mean, I have so many examples, but what I can say is that when there's no regret, like no parent has ever, messaged me and said, I regret telling my kid this, that's just not going to happen. And the truth is that unfortunately, a lot of times when parents finally muster up the courage to have these conversations, their child will say, well, actually, such and such thing happened. I just had a parent the other day who was like, we're having this conversation about penises and vaginas and like body safety and private part safety and all that. And when I said penis, my child who was 4, going to daycare was like, "Oh, my friend at school like is, trying to show me like get me to show him." And so she was able to have a conversation, with the teacher and thank her child, like, thank you for telling me. And like, I mean, that's at 4, right? So it's never too late. Like, a lot of times we think, oh, kids don't understand or they're not going to get it. They get it. And the more we have these conversations, the more likely our kids are going to report. And that's, statistically, they don't feel safe to report. They have a lot of fear of what's the repercussion going to be. And I think it's important for parents to also remind their kids that everybody makes mistakes, right? And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of parents make is the threat of taking away the devices. And so even if you say, I'm not going to punish you or, you're not going to be in trouble, if in the past you've taken away the device for other trivial things, then that's like not matching up with what you're saying. So we have to be conscious parents about, how we discipline, about how we create these safe spaces. And I think that's equally just as important as teaching body safety. Like we really have to match our words with our actions. And I think that's really critical as part of how we navigate these conversations.
You mentioned that for some parents, sharing your own experiences is, you know, kind of key. And I think for us, we see a lot of parents who maybe have struggled with their own pornography habit or are actively struggling with a pornography habit or were sexually abused as children but haven't really spoken about it. And how would you recommend to parents to approach navigating any of those challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, when I talk about sharing your own experiences, I certainly am not advocating for anyone to share any kind of trauma or unhealed trauma, especially. And it also really depends on your child's age. Like, I don't recommend sharing, those traumatic experiences with children at an early age, because there's a lot of reasons for mental health reasons to not share that with your children right away. I think depending on what your experiences were, you can always say, I like, and I know kids will ask questions, but you can say something like, when I grew up, I didn't have a lot of safe experiences, and I wish that somebody was there to help me, to talk about it or to be able to share with them what happened. But I wasn't sure because I wasn't, I didn't know if people were going to believe me. I didn't know if I was going to get in trouble, you know, sharing in that way. And then if your child's like, what kind of experiences like are you talking about, and you can say, well, when you're older, we can dive into those details. You don't really need to know them right now, but what you do need to know is that a lot of kids actually, have the potential for experiencing unsafe situations. because of what happened to me, I've learned from that, and I want to make sure that I can help you be safe. So I think that's the extent, especially with younger kids. And if you're at a space with your child where you've been having those open conversations, they're older, and you're sensing that there's some unsafe situation happening there, and you feel like you're in a healed enough safe space where you can share it from that healed place, then you can maybe share some of that. But I always recommend with parents who have lived experiences that if you haven't done the work yourself to heal and to do that process of being able to talk about it in a way that will feel safe for your child, then hold off and do that work internally first. And for anyone who does have those previous experiences of addiction, or if pornography was used in a way that groomed them or manipulated them or exploited them, um, that can be really hard. So I always recommend seeking out that support, that mental health support, to do that healing first before you have those conversations.
And thank you so much for adding that. I do think that's something, especially for our listeners, that there's often a hesitation because of not knowing how to address something that they're still addressing themselves. And I think it's important to note you still can address it, and your child will thank you, right? So that they, especially if you've had to experience something difficult as a survivor or someone who's experienced a habit with porn, you know what the difficult pieces of that are with no resources as a kid. So if you can prevent your child from experiencing that, that is the goal. And there are so many resources, as you mentioned, to help. Can you let our listeners know where they can access your resources and learn more from you after listening to this episode?
For sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, people can find my resources at consentparenting.com, as well as aboutconsent.com, which is a platform, my podcast for survivors.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And if you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway about consent education, consent parenting, what would it be?
I would say to not be afraid to have those conversations. They are so incredibly empowering. Like, if you start from a place of trusting that this can empower both of you and heal any, past issues that you've had, traumas that you've had, and that that this can, break cycles. If you step in with that energy of like, I'm afraid, but I'm going to do it anyway, and just dive in, I think it will be incredibly rewarding both to you and your child. But also, this is how we change culture. This is how we reduce the statistics. And I just want to remind parents that child sexual abuse is not inevitable. It is absolutely preventable. Actually, education helps prevent up to 90% of abuse. So that should be, really good news, and remind you that to help that happen, you have to, participate, and you have to be proactive. So, you know, dig deep for that courage if you're afraid to have these conversations, and dive in, because I promise you, you will not regret it.
Thank you so much, Rosalia. It's been so nice to get to speak with you today. For any of our listeners, we encourage you to please check out the resources linked in the show notes to learn more about consent parenting and resources you can use with your own children, or if you are an aunt or an uncle or interact with children, ways that you can help ensure we are tackling these issues together for this generation of youth. For any of our listeners, please remember to subscribe for more episodes like this. And thanks again for listening.
Hey, fighters. We know that pornography can have a serious impact on mental health, especially for kids and teens growing up in today's digital world. That's why we've partnered with Bark. Their parental control app blocks harmful content and alerts parents or guardians about potential dangers online, from inappropriate websites to cyberbullying or predatory behavior. Try Bark for 1 month on us with the code FTND2, or head to ftnd.org/bark to get started today. That's FTND/BARK.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Consider Before Consuming. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects, using only science, facts, and personal accounts. Check out the episode notes for resources mentioned in this episode. If you find this podcast helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a review. Consider Before Consuming is made possible by listeners like you. If you'd like to support Consider Before Consuming, you can make a one-time or recurring donation of any amount at ftnd.org/support. That's ftnd.org/support. Thanks again for listening. We invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.